I just want to thank NSF for all of the support and for allowing this collection of programs to happen. We wouldn't be able to do it without you, so I just want to thank you so much. My name is Nathan Quarderer. I'm a postdoc and interim director of education at Earthlab, which is part of the Cooperative Institute for Research of the Environmental Sciences at CU Boulder. I'm part of the education and outreach kind of coordinating committee, I guess, for this event today. I want to introduce my colleague, Paula Maybe. Paula, would you stand up? Paula works at Neon and Battelle. She's also been a big help for this morning's session. And then Valerie Barr at Bard College, she's on her way. She'll be here later this morning, but she's here in spirit. And then we also have a guest speaker that I'll introduce in a second, Michelle Holko from Google, who's going to talk a little bit about the care and fair principles and what those things mean. So if you could go to the next slide. I'll just give you a quick rundown. The schedule for our morning events might look a little different than what you've seen online. Not much change, but I'll briefly introduce what we're going to talk about. We'll get to meet our guest speaker. And then we have kind of an interactive plan where we have different scenarios that we like tables to kind of walk through. And then we'll have some time at the end for each group to share out kind of what came of those discussions. So go ahead, next slide. So yeah, again, my name is Nate Quarderer. I'm a postdoc at CU Boulder. I'm also the interim director of education at Earthlab. I'm here to represent a data science core called the Earth Data Science Core, or EDSC. There's our award number there. So we were funded in 2019. This is our third year of funding. We did get a one-year extension. So we were one of those groups that couldn't use all of the money because we were having a hard time recruiting students due to issues related to COVID. I'll talk really briefly about what the EDSC is all about. So this is it's a program that partnered with 5 partner institutions, including 2 tribal colleges and universities. We also worked with a Hispanic serving institution and a community college in the Western US. Over the 3 years of our program, we worked with 60 students, 8 faculty partners. The EDSC largely consists of a 12-week paid internship where participating students and their faculty meet with us virtually. I'm going to do a quick timeout and mention that prior to the start of EDSC, which was funded prior to COVID, we had intended to bring everybody to CU for an intense boot camp style situation, and then COVID happened, and so we abruptly shifted everything to completely Zoom. And so I can talk more about that in my poster tomorrow, but that's just one example of the impact that COVID had on our particular project. The focus of the content that students learn through the EDSC consists of earth and environmental science, relevant GIS, and then they do all that using Python. And so students come in having 0 experience with Python, and they walk out and they're able to do some really incredible stuff. It's an immersive online project-based learning experience. So again, folks work with us for about 6 weeks in a training kind of setting, and then they go to their home institutions and work on an applied project for the remaining 6 weeks. A couple examples of projects that have come out of the EDSC that I think are relevant to what Michelle is going to talk about here this morning. I have 2 screenshots here. In 2019, or I apologize, in 2020, we had a group from Ogallala Lakota College in Kyle, South Dakota, who did a project on COVID-19 data on their reservation. And then in 2021, so last summer, we had a group from the same tribal college, Ogallala Lakota College, do a project that used LiDAR to look for geomorphological and culturally relevant locations on their campuses. And so things that came out of these projects that we as program directors had to struggle with were, when we're working particularly with tribal colleges and universities, who owns this data when we're done, right? There are issues related to data sovereignty that I don't think we're prepared for when we started this program. And we grappled with those ideas throughout the 3 years, and we're still trying to grapple with, like, who owns this data? Where does it live? Who has the rights to access it? How do we share it publicly in a way that honors our partners, but also helps tell the story in a way that we think is important? And so we've been wrestling with issues related to the care and fair principles and Indigenous data sovereignty. And so just a quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the FAIR principles? How many of you are familiar with the CARE principles? Maybe not as many, okay. And so we brought an expert in this morning to talk about these two things. I should mention that we found Michelle. Paula's group at Neon is working on a project that's taking all of their data and putting it into Google Cloud. And Paula said, I'm working with somebody on this project. I think I've got a really great speaker that could come in and talk when we meet in Virginia in a few weeks. And so I'm gonna turn it over to Michelle here in just a second, but I want to read my, I left my phone here. Michelle, I need to read your bio, and I left it on my phone. So, yeah, Dr. Holko is a scientist, a strategic innovator working at the intersection of biology, technology, and security. She recently served in government as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow and led projects at NIH, DHS, CISA, HHS, BARDA, and DoD. Her technical expertise is in genomics, bioinformatics, biosecurity, and wearable sensor data. So you're probably wearing one right now. She has experience in academia and in government working on solutions for cancer, pandemic preparedness and prevention, data stewardship, digital health technology, health equity, and security related to new and emerging technologies in health and science. She's currently a principal architect and scientist at the Google Public Sector for Healthcare, and science. She leads a research area at the intersection between cybersecurity and biotechnology, including research at the International Computer Science Institute at Berkeley. Okay. With that, I'll turn it over to Michelle Holko.
Awesome.
Can you use this?
Oh, great. Okay.
You probably need to point to the computer.
Point to the back.
Right.
Okay.
And then this is the laser.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. It is so nice to be here. Thank you so much to Nate and to Paula for connecting us all together. And I'd like to first start out by saying I'm not an expert in the CARE principles. It's something that I think we all need to put our heads together to learn about and to think about. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit with where I'm approaching this interesting space from. And then, we're really excited to have a discussion with all of you about how we can actually put these principles into practice, and more importantly, how we can honor not only the FAIR principles, but also the CARE principles, so that we have a more inclusive research community around data. So as Nate mentioned, I'm sitting at Google Cloud. It's actually Google Public Sector. They created a new organization to really firm up their commitment to the public sector. And so most of my career after my postdoctoral fellowship has been spent in the government. And so I actually see this as an opportunity for me personally to do kind of the government mission from a space like Google, where I have access to amazing technology. So it's kind of like being a kid in a candy store. And at the same time, bringing the really important missions that I've seen happening both at NIH, at NSF, at DoD, pretty much all over the board. And certainly being in the White House and a scientist during the administration when COVID happened was an interesting experience, as you may all understand. And so instead of having this like delay of action, I actually was like way busy, had 6 different government computers working at the same time, trying to make Operation Warp Speed happen and really paying attention to the security aspects of that. So I think a lot about security and data in the context of all of the work that you guys are trying to do. So as Nate mentioned, my background is in genetics. After my postdoc, after doing my PhD in genetics, it was during the time of microarrays, if anybody remembers that, kind of before next-gen sequencing took off. And that's really why I became fascinated with this interplay of how technology creates the opportunity for growth in science and research. You know, unless and until we're starting to collect data and new data streams that are able to tell us more information, and the way that that changes the way that we're able to do science. So let's see if I can get this to work without standing on my head or anything crazy. Okay. All right, so I'm going to frame, before I go into the care and fair principles and kind of data stewardship in general, I'm going to frame it out in terms of, you know, my perspective from where I'm sitting right now. So the Google mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And one of the things that excites me so much is that Google's done a great job of that with internet data, right? We've all experienced doing a Google search and finding internet data at our fingertips. But what if we did that with research data? Like, what if you actually were able to tap into research data sets that were highly relevant to the problem you're trying to answer, and then do research based on that? And so that's really where I'm coming at it from, is how can we do that same thing with research data? You know, I think a lot about the biomedical research space, but increasingly, you know, thinking about geospatial data, wearables, sensor data, et cetera. And then, you know, the other piece that I think is highly relevant here is to reinvent education and research everywhere so that everybody has access to the quality education they deserve and can answer bigger questions faster. And I think it's this answer bigger questions faster piece, you know, that we think a lot about with the cloud, because certainly with cloud computing, you have an opportunity to access different types of compute, larger data sets, and to do things in a more kind of real-time fashion rather than, you know, setting something and coming back to it a week later and then you have your results. But the other thing I want to highlight here is that everyone has access. And that's a really important point that we want to bring home today, is that, you know, the FAIR principles may not be sufficient in order to make sure that we're having an inclusive research conversation and paying attention to what everybody values and thinks is important, and bringing everybody to the table in terms of research. Okay, let's see. Maybe if I point it there. Okay. I think pointing it there works. Another important point is that Google actually grew out of artificial intelligence and machine learning research. And so our, you know, kind of data, our DNA is in the research space. And so I'm really excited that I get to still think about these research questions from this role that I'm in, because that's kind of where I also find meaning. And so just kind of an overview of some of the benefits of using the cloud in research that speak to, you know, some of the data principles and how I'm approaching the problem in terms of how can we leverage the technology so that it can help us be better stewards of the data and also pay attention to all of these principles that we care about. So reproducibility is a huge issue in science. I think we've all experienced the fact that, you know, someone leaves a lab and leave notes and programs, but it's not actually sufficient to reproduce what they had done. And so a new student has to come in and kind of replicate that. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so it's estimated that up to 50% of articles published even in top tier journals are not reproducible, at least not until you figure out what they're doing. And so one of the things that we can leverage technology to do is, when it comes to the analytic workflows, when it comes to figuring out what data sets were used, we can absolutely use technology in a way with containerized structures and, you know, open sharing of these methods so that we can improve the reproducibility on that side at least. Collaboration. So being able to share your workflows with your collaborators much more easily. So saving things as containers, you know, using GitHub. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this and use this, but this is another thing that we see as really valuable for the community. In the same way, continuity. So being able to actually you know, pass things off from postdoc to new postdoc coming in, or graduate student to new graduate student coming in, or vice versa. Continuous improvement. So constantly being able to simplify and develop your workflows, improve them, make them more efficient. And then certainly community. So, you know, there's a specific solution that we're developing called Earthlab for public sector, that we have a data science module, we have genomics modules, we are working on a geospatial module, we have a silicon design module, but the goal there is to create a system where researchers can develop their own modules that can be freely shared within this kind of a community ecosystem and infrastructure. So not having to be a cloud engineer, but still being able to leverage the cloud and all of the resources there. And certainly, thinking about One Google, we have a lot of different pockets in Alphabet, as you may be aware. I get to work very closely with my Fitbit colleagues, so I actually really like my Apple Watch still, but got a Fitbit when we were at a meeting together, and it's really cool too. So I'm just kind of fascinated with all of the technology that we're coming out with, and really being able to look across and see, how we can bring all of these tools together to really improve what we're able to discover with research. I'm still not sure where to point, and it's like sometimes it works in one place and other times. Okay, there we go. So what I really wanted to talk about today was the fact that, over the past year, well, actually less than a year, I guess starting in about February, I've been engaging deeply with an organization called the Native Biodata Consortium, NBDC. And this is a group of Indigenous researchers from lots of different institutions who came together and recognized that their values around data sovereignty were not being served by NIH and the FAIR principles that have come out widely. And so they wanted to kind of take back their own power. There's a large history of colonization coming in and kind of stealing data, using it for gain, for financial gain that doesn't actually end up benefiting the people who donated the data in the first place. And in some cases, there have been really egregious efforts that have instead tried to raise potential vulnerabilities or in populations that donated the data, that they didn't approve that research to be done, and then it ended up where it just was a lot of bad feelings all around, right? And so there's this large history of kind of people coming in, taking data and using it, right? And so what they're trying to do is not only stand up their own biobank so that they can house the samples on data on land that's sovereign, but they're also thinking about the data structure. And so I've been, having conversations with this group over the last 6 to 9 months. And one of those conversations was at Indigidata, which is a conference that they hold around education. So they invite students to apply to participate in a week-long on tribal land conversation about using data and research as an Indigenous researcher. And one of the things that really struck me about this, and so this slide is from the talk that I gave there, because at the end, towards the end of the meeting, I talked about the cloud and how it can be used and how we can use it to apply data sovereignty principles. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight was the fact that I spent that whole week just listening, because it was so far outside of my experience of having grown up in academia and being steeped in that and not having that cultural perspective, that it was really impactful for me. And so I just wanted to share some of the thoughts that came along through that week. And one of them was that I heard students actually saying that they grappled with not feeling capable or able to participate in academic research because of the focus on open data sharing. And if it's their value to respect the data sovereignty, how do you actually do that? How do you become a successful researcher who's able to share and publish your data if there's this cultural tension that you're feeling? And so I think that there are ways through this, but I do think that it's going to take a community and a lot of creativity, frankly, but mostly listening and respect. Next slide. I'm just going to say next slide, if that works. And then the last thing I want to anchor in, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the details that you might consider when you're thinking about this kind of dynamic tension issue, is that if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it? Right? And so this Einstein quote is one of my favorites. And what it does for me is it anchors me in humility and curiosity at the same time, right? And so remembering that we don't have all the answers, that's okay. It's totally okay not to have all the answers. But at the same time, coming up with potential solutions and then bouncing them off each other and other communities so that we can come to a place where everybody feels included. Next slide. So one of the things that I also wanted to highlight about Indigenous research is that it often reflects data coming from many sources. So even the folks that are focused on biomedical data, they believe very strongly that it has direct ties to the earth, right? And so they are often layering, soil microbiome data with geospatial data, satellite imagery, and this is one of the things that I think is most relevant to this group is that, in the sense that, the groups here are looking at large data sets, lots of geospatial, lots of climate. And so it is not out of the realm of possibility that you will encounter this kind of a scenario. And Nate has done a great job of putting together some scenarios for us to kind of think about of, so if you do end up, doing research that involves tribal land or working with tribal partners, how can you have already thought about a little bit some of the issues that might pertain here? And at the same time, thinking about so where the data come from, what does that mean in terms of who owns what? And certainly, I feel like I would own my own genetic data, but would I necessarily own the data from the ground that I walked on? I'm not sure. And I think, when we think about satellite imagery data, should we treat satellite imagery data for tribal lands differently, or how do we respect the sovereignty pieces? And I also think that, data sovereignty is a concept. And I have my next slide, I'll talk a little bit about it if you want to go ahead to the next slide, is a concept, but it's also a continuum. It's kind of like security. Nothing's ever 100% secure, right? I mean, that's the whole thing. It's like you spend a lot of time thinking about security and trying to balance the security and innovation pieces. But how do you actually do this in practice so that it, again, respects people and persons and ideas, but at the same time, doesn't stifle innovation? So the FAIR principles, this is basically the punchline. The FAIR principles encourage open data, but what about the CARE principles? And how can technology be used to achieve data sovereignty? So in the next slide, so some of the guiding principles for native data sovereignty. Number one, the location of the data. Data are in a lot of ways thought to want to reside where they were created. So for example, COVID test data should reside where they were created. So if you're looking at COVID test data from a tribal community, then those data should actually reside there. So then what about these cloud distributed systems? And what about, RADX and trying to bring all of the data together in one database? That can be handled. You can use the cloud in ways where you have certain data that are on premise, and then they get connected up with APIs so that you're able to send analytic jobs. So there are ways around these things, but just really thinking through that. We also have, Google writ large has partnered with various tribes to create data centers on tribal lands. And certainly this is an expensive way to go. So it's not the fix for every situation, but something to consider. Security is another huge feature that goes along with data sovereignty, because you're trying to make sure that only the right people have access to it and only are able to use it in the right ways. So in the same way that you can use, kind of general security best practices, the principles of least privilege, as well as multi-factor authentication and zero trust to authenticate users and who can have access. You can also use audit logging to figure out, when have these data been seen, what has been done with them, and then what are the outputs from that. And then certainly, data research and governance, I think, which is, one of the things that we should all think about is, how do we think about research that does no harm, research that respects every person who's bringing data to the table, and then how do we share out those results in a way that also returns value to the people who gave the data. So also thinking about kind of the commercialization aspects of it, and not having the scenario where someone, takes all of this information from a tribal community and then makes a bunch of money on it, and then the money doesn't go back to the tribal community. That's definitely not something that we're after. Next slide. And then this is the last slide. So in the scenarios here that Nate's going to go over, and then we're going to kind of do small groups and float around, thinking about like what are the data types you're thinking about, how could these other data types be accessed or shared with other organizations? Is that appropriate? And when and in what ways? What about adding other data types to the data set? What does that mean in terms of the security and also the sovereignty piece of it? Where should data live? How can they be connected? Frameworks for review and approval of research that can be flexible and again, kind of evolve over time. And then also, what about resources and working across tribal nations and different organizations? How do we think about equitable resourcing? And so I will pause there and happy to meet you all.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Could we go to the next slide? Okay, so we don't have 30 minutes to do this, but we've got a little less than that, and that's okay. So what we have set up, we've got 4 different scenarios. I guess 3 scenarios and what we're calling a wild card. But in a second, we'll go to the next slide, and you're going to see 4 QR codes on the screen before you. And how many tables are there? 9. So let's do this. Why don't tables 1 and 2, you take scenario 1. Tables 3 and 4, take scenario 2. Tables 4 and 5, take scenario 5 and 6, take the 3rd scenario, and then maybe 7, 8, and 9, take the wild card. We'll figure it out. What we'd like you to do once you figure out what scenario you're going to walk through is walk through that scenario with your table. Talk about how you would handle this situation that we've put in front of you. We've got a Google Doc for each one of these scenarios. You should have editing rights, so you can go in there and take notes in the doc about what your table thinks about this scenario. And then we'll have some time at the end. Hopefully we can go around and hear from each group and get a sense of how you would have dealt with that particular situation. So why don't we go to the next slide? And then if we could like designate a person from each table, maybe to come up here. Maybe you don't even need to come up, but take a picture of the QR code for your table. Valerie's here. Yes, what's up? Valerie, hi, Valerie. Send somebody from your table up to take a picture of one of these QR codes. Maybe a couple people from each table. And then you should be able to open that up in a Google Doc on your phone. So it's 11:35 right now. Let's go until 11:50, and then we'll go around and hear from each table. Does that sound okay? Hello. We're going to go about 1 more minute, and then we're going to start asking groups to share.
Right, because frankly, because otherwise.
Yeah, the scenario in our university would play out in terms of hiring staff as well as
Okay. I hate interrupting you in the middle of these good conversations, but we want to remain on schedule and we want to be sure that we get a chance to hear from everybody. And so what I'm going to do, we're going to come around to each table and give each table the microphone. And you can nominate somebody from your table to just share out what are some high-level takeaways from the conversation that you had. And we'll give each table about a minute or so to share out. Who wants to start? Table 7? So what's going to happen?
Maybe I'll ask you guys to chime in if you have something.
Share out what scenario you talked about and what were some of the big takeaways from your table. Right. Okay.
Okay, should I start? So we got the wildcard, which was really looking at examples of data that we have dealt with and what were the conflicts that we saw or situations we saw around care and fair principles. We came up with a couple of interesting examples. One was around the genome-wide association data, where how do we decide who owns the public level or population level genome data versus who owns the individual genome level data. And especially if there are indigenous groups involved, there could be specific disease scenarios that could be in that population, who owns that data. And one interesting thing that came up at the end was, if you're talking about differential privacy, if the community is as small as 20 people, where does that play in? And of course, there's ethical elements as well to that. Another example we talked about was polar region data, which some of us in IHARP are dealing with. And many of these data sets are remote sensing open data. So I think there was a question of who owns the remote sensing data and how should we deal with that, especially in the indigenous community regions. But then there are places like in Alaska, where there are several groups of indigenous communities where there is more relevant data as well. And then beyond the indigenous communities, there's also science communities which have sovereignty of the data that they have collected with several field missions and such. So how do we keep the science open, but also respect the ownership, sovereignty, and ethics of the data as well? And I think we all, I think, agreed that there's conflict in the care and fair principles that we have to carefully navigate on both sides. So keeping it open, but also respecting and the ethical principles behind it. Did I miss anything?
Yeah. We also quickly discussed there's even tension between these principles. They're not clear cut. They're not necessarily all consistent when applied to these many different scenarios.
A lot came out of this one. This is great discussion here. So should we stay on the same scenario? Do the or does someone else want to volunteer? Mix it up. Okay. Over to one.
Thank you. Well, table 1, we have the scenario 1. To summarize the scenario, we are having a partnership project with a tribal institution where It's a remote sensing project, NSF funded, and we bumped into some culturally sensitive artifacts and information that we. Okay. So just wanted to give them their time. So, so culturally sensitive information, we bumped into it, and now how do we go about handling this data? That is, how do we go about publishing it and disseminating this information and all of that? So we discussed a lot of possible ways to potentially handle this, acknowledging and understanding that openness is the key in collecting this information in the first place, but at the same time, understanding the culturally sensitive information. And partnership literally means having an open communication. So that means that we respect their sovereignty, and we wanted to allow them to let us use or publicize as much information that they are comfortable with. So as long as there is an agreement. And one other way we thought this could be handled is having a governmental policy, intergovernmental policy that the tribal nations and the United States government could have in place that could act as a template that all of us can potentially use. And also, we wanted to differentiate the data, raw data, versus the processed output. So depending on the platform where we are putting this output, like ArcGIS or whatever platform we are using, we can have certain levels of access that are open and certain levels of access that requires certain credentials to access. So we can provide a controlled access to the data. That's another way we thought we can handle this situation. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And just one additional piece to that. I think one of the things when we think about open and reproducibility, we can publish methods without necessarily having to publish the data source, right? When we're trying to respect data sovereignty. So, but still publishing those methods can improve interoperability and reproducibility. Who'd like to go next?
Okay, is this on? Yeah. Okay, so we're table 3. We had scenario number 2. The scenario was about climate data coming from a tribal community. And so there were 2 different sort of levels of discussion. One was understanding where the data are actually coming from. So this was important. So where the data being collected from weather stations actually on the tribal lands? Would they be collected from weather stations around the tribal lands, maybe, and then interpolated across the tribal lands? I was also thinking about wearable sensors on people, including miners, and then from satellites, maybe in uncontrolled airspace. And then my colleague here was bringing up another number of issues. Do you want to address those?
So a lot of data like climate, weather, and I deal a lot with biodiversity data, does not respect political borders and jurisdictions. And so, but yet can disclose a lot about a particular location. So there's the rules, policies, and regulations, but there is also the ethical aspect of the data provenance, the data use, the primary data provenance, who contributed the data, who actually owns the data, who owns the derived metadata, and so on and so forth. So I think the most important aspect of this conversation was we need to ask questions, making sure that we don't destroy the very part that we're trying to, research, protect, improve, make an impact for in the process of researching, improving, and making an impact for. So having conversations with the local authorities, with the local representatives, to ensure that the data that we're collecting doesn't disclose something that we can't even think about at the moment of collecting that data. We've seen examples of this quite a bit, actually. And so in using things that exist in other domains, such as healthcare, for example, to ensure that data may be usable and generating synthetic versions with the same properties of the data in aggregate, but is still respecting the local kind of aspects of the data.
Awesome. Yeah, one other thing just to note is that different communities and different tribal nations may have different thoughts about data sharing and what that should look like and could look like. So there's no one size fits all. There's no one answer that's going to work in every scenario. And it really is about, listening and trying to work together to come to figure out, what's going to be okay for everybody. I think we're going to table 6.
Yeah, hello, my name is Brandon Cruz at table 6 here. We got the scenario number 3. It's about when you're volunteering at a local shelter that collects sensitive data. So our discussion was revolving around how do we actually protect the community and the individual. So the issues that we raised here were about access control, privacy, and depending on the size of the data we're collecting, we wanted to ensure that we reduce the cost of processing on the cloud. So we talked about how to come up with a board to have discussions about the ethical aspects of how to use the data, ensure accountability, and how to use a ledger system to keep track of who is accessing the data. To ensure the privacy, we discussed about using federated learning and keep the data where is it collected. So for example, if we're collecting on the shelter, we would use low-end hardware devices there to do the processing there. And if you want to access the data to do any kind of processing, you would go through the board to access whatever was processed there. And we also would try to anonymize to ensure that there is no easy way to find who are the individuals inside the community that the data was collected. And the board of directors, the ethical board would discuss dissemination, ethical questions, accessibility, and accountability for data access.
Awesome. Thank you. Who's next? 2, 4, 8. All right, 4.
Two microphones coming at me. It's exciting. So we had scenario number 2, which is the collection of climate data on tribal lands and the creation of the dashboard. And so how do the principles apply? So one underlying question is whether that data actually is public. And it, as the other group said, it depends on the source. The scenario to us seems set up to be biased toward care, but making so that the data were in the private land with the dashboard created for the local community. It seems like that just biased the whole question toward local, but fair then becomes much harder. Which then leads to the question, what are the actual concerns over sharing? I think someone had mentioned that. This is one of the funs of going later, that all your ideas are stolen. And so it also raises the question of the tension between the use of raw data and the derived summary data. But of course, as we know, the derived summary data becomes the raw data for the next level of analysis. So that's a little hard. And then we got a little sidetracked, and that was my fault, but we compared the discussion we have done, that Tanya's and my teams have done, on population surveys in Kenya, where participating in collection and to a lesser extent analysis led to a lot more acceptance by the Kenyan authorities and openness of sharing. And so that participatory effect right through all the aspects of the process leads to much more acceptance and willing to share.
That's an awesome call out. All right, who's next? 2, 5, 8, or 9? 8.
So we have a wildcard question, which is like explain a scenario where you are responsible for handling data, and how do you handle that data, and do you think these methods reflect the fair care principles? So we choose one using the specific disease data. Say, for example, during the COVID, we are collecting human data. Say we are collecting the heart rate and skin temperature. Now we have many ways to track human data, say wearable Apple Watch, for example. I don't have one, but maybe say, for example, you have one, say I'm sick and my body temperature is 101 and you are not, yours is say 97, but somebody may have that data, right? Doing research and COVID research from Apple database. Now, the question is, somebody can tell I'm sick, he's not. Now, the person got the clearance and have agreed to the privacy statement, but is the data still safe? That's the question. So we found out like a few way to make the data safe would be like pretty much like using the Google Authenticator, like two-step process. Say I have access to the data, I'm doing the research, and I'm going to share it, say, with some other institution, for example, say UCLA, they want to do some research. Now I want to share the data, but I need permission from him. He will get his own passcode to, okay, I also authenticate sharing the data. But we thought maybe adding one more layer, like a third layer from some other institution, okay, you can also share the data. That would be a good way to protect the privacy of those people. And then we can also do like, who can access the data? Does the person has IRB approval or knows how to secure login? And then we discussed about like a personnel who is handling the data should have a proper training, like how to handle the data. Like I want to share the data to anyone. No, who can I share the data? Do I have a proper ethical training? These things are important. And then also putting some access control to the data is also important. That's what we found out. And did I miss anything, or you guys want to add something?
I think you addressed all the points. One point I would like to mention that most of the research in HDR are interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary sometimes. So it's not the computer scientist or information scientist are on the table. Actually, you have the domain researcher. So for example, you have the healthcare or clinician or doctor with your researcher. They may need different types of access sometime. Compared to us, we are sometimes happy with the raw data or the coded leveling of the data. But to become the caring to the human subject in this case, maybe the older adults, they have to provide right feedback to the right people at the right time. And they need to know who are those people sometimes. So as Sudeep mentioned, like there are different types of hierarchical access control we actually discuss on that. How do we provide those control through the IRB approval to the domain researcher, to the other researchers, so that different people have different types of access on the same data sets. Yeah.
This on?
Yeah.
I just love that there's like so many similarities, even though you're looking at different scenarios, like all of these same issues like continue to come up, whether you're looking at weather data or health data or whatever. We have a couple tables left, I think, right? 2. We don't want to force anybody either,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Hi, I'm Katie. My lovely colleagues here at table 2, we investigated the remote sensing scenario that table 1 talked about. And remote sensing data typically is open because most of us don't have, the funds to shoot up our own satellite, although that's getting more and more affordable. And so that data, how do I frame this? Typically, that data is open to begin with. So now we want to focus that though and work with our partners in the tribes just based on probably a research question that they're interested in or a policy question they're interested in, things like that. So the strategy here is to show them how to collect the data, make that as open and transparent and reproducible as possible. So in the future, they can do it again. But then I think there is a conversation with the tribe. And in my experience, that has even gone into the tribal elders where when you maybe analyze the data or synthesize it, however you want to do that, you have a discussion with them and then you're like, here, this is what the data says. How would you like to move forward? Here are some options that I see. And then it's sort of your responsibility to research. If they say, hey, we're good, you actually do have to walk away, which can be really hard given our training. And so that's something that you kind of have to learn to deal with and also manage with your institution. So the table talked about actually too, like what happens when you say, okay, I spent time on this project, but I don't have a paper or a deliverable that counts in our world. What are some other options and thinking about that? And that will depend on where you're at. So I'm in the College of Agriculture at a land grant institution. So those kind of scenarios come up all the time where it's like, hey, we did this project with this partner and that's where we got to. And that's okay. But if you're maybe at a different institution with different expectations and different missions, then that's a different conversation. And we also talked about the Office of General Counsel and what is their relationship at your institution with your partners. Always, that's something to check about. So yes, what? Yes. Oh, one thing we did spend time talking about, which might be useful for the presenters also, is having a brief summary of what the care and fair principles are as they relate to Carol's papers. So just to remind everybody and familiarize them. Is that, did I catch everything? Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Just two things I want to highlight from what you shared. Number one, it's a very consultative approach, what you outlined there in terms of, working directly with partners, but then throughout that process, checking in and then making those decisions together, which I think is fantastic. And having the freedom to not be wedded to the specific outcome of publishing a paper, I think is incredibly important. So that's awesome. But then in that case, we need to think about how are you going to be incentivized to do that, and what is your deliverable then?
I'd just like to ask a question. At the beginning, you sort of said, and maybe I misunderstood, that satellite data was open. And that's probably true for most data now, except that suppose I'm working for SpaceX or Rocket Lab or somewhere else, and I have a commercial satellite that was given to me to put up, and it's owned by such and such an industry. I think that's even true for the government's cases. How do I know that that data is actually open? And that data then may carry intellectual property with it. How does that figure into this?
I don't know if it's been said yet, but having appropriate metadata associated with the data, sorry, I stepped out for a second, but it's one thing to consider. And so a lot of the FAIR documentation is around metadata. I've seen some of the CARE stuff talking about metadata, but
yeah, thank you. That was an excellent response. Thank you for not, yeah, I want to amplify what I'm sorry, your name is Jane. What Jane just said is that, yeah, the metadata component is really important for that and trying to figure that out. I think in experience with working with tribes, and I have very limited experience, just like 3 examples that I'm drawing from, actually with remote sensing data, so that was fortuitous. But I try to stick with things that don't add more complexity to an already complex system. But it depends where you're at, right? And how do I navigate that?
If you're going to have an impact on economy and so forth using the methods of data science, then you're going to have to deal with intellectual property. And none of the examples that have come through so far does that.
Yeah.
So I'm just talking about.
Yeah, that's a point.
Yeah.
And it may be that it was Navajo incorporated satellite, or not of it.
Yeah. Should we wrap up? Let's get that last down. I think let's wrap up.
In other words, we will bring what is comfortable. It's basically in agreement that we anyway. So that's how we've been working so far. So.
Is that right?
Does
We have
anybody
time
else
for
want to
one
go,
more?
or should we wrap up?
So this is table 5. I'm Hriday Rajan from Iowa State University, and we were discussing the healthcare data from shelter. We thought that a number of principles have already been went over by the healthcare community. For example, access to medical data is very restrictive. Care is exercised, so one is the data doesn't leak out, and that's really very important to consider in this setting as well. A lot of what we said also was said earlier, so I'm going to focus on two important scenarios that came out. One had to deal with retention of data. So being very clear about from the get-go about how long is the data going to be kept and when is it going to be destroyed, and having because keeping something forever isn't necessarily very wise either. We made a segue there, and we talked about when a faculty member is being hired who has actually worked at the same institution. Sometimes people go back and look at the letter of recommendations from when they apply for graduate admissions or their grades and so on. Is that really desirable? Another real life inspired situation was when a candidate was applying to work at a youth shelter in which the candidate was made use of when they were young, and the data for that particular person was kept when they were interviewing for the position of director of that center. And so that's these kind of retention becomes a problem, because you don't do you really want to make use of the data that they had as a child to make hiring decisions about them. So we thought the retention is something that we should be careful about and discuss more than we need to.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more, and then we're gonna break. And so table 9, you've been waiting patiently. We appreciate that.
Golly, well, I try to keep under 1 minute. We talked about 3 different things. We talked about differential privacy. We talked about actual data governance when universities have relationships with companies. Like our team has 70 different projects with industry companies. We talked about how that actually plays out in practice. And then we emphasize regarding data governance and people from First Nations. The SOCNIS meeting is actually happening today, the Society for Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in the Sciences. And I mean, I think we were just commenting on how it's so important to have scientists from First Nations actually, speaking for the governance of their data. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks everybody so much. Want to say a few words, Michelle, to wrap things up, or?
Well, just thank you all for the discussion. It's always, I think, helpful to try to think about how to put these things into practice. And one of the things that I think is really helpful is there are some papers out there in the literature about the care and fair principles and operationalizing them. And one of the things that I've seen is it would be helpful to have even more specific guidance about that. And so I've been working with the Native Biodata Consortium on potentially that and publishing some stuff. So if anybody, it sounds like there are a lot of groups that have experience navigating this. And if you'd like to collaborate on that, please reach out to me. I have to leave for another thing, but I'm happy to share out my contact information with all of you. So thank you.
Thanks. Can we give Michelle a round of applause? And per one of the comments, I think was from this table about sharing resources about what care and fair principles are, we'll happily share those out with the group for those that are interested in reading more.
Yeah.
Paula or Valerie, do you want to add anything before we wrap up the morning session?
Can I just say, I don't want to keep people from lunch, but I don't recognize anybody here that's been involved in the RDA, the Research Data Alliance. That's been a global initiative that NSF has supported over the last few years. Somebody else, who? Tanya, you've been in it. Yes. A lot, Paula, you have, okay, good. A lot of working groups, a lot of efforts have come out of there, and you can find it on the web. And there is a lot of stuff. It really is around FAIR, a pretty vibrant community. So I just wanted to make sure people are aware of that. Thanks.
Right. Okay. And thanks for breakout session. Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. No, not lunch yet.
Oh, sorry, Jesus. They you heard about the breakout sessions in when Shichi was talking earlier, and you'll have a chance to sign up for those. We're going to have breakout sessions focused on education and outreach topics. We'd love to chat with you. Looks like that'll be happening tonight. We've got two topics, one focused on undergraduate data science education and another focused on sustainable and reproducible data science research. We would love to chat with you about those topics. And so if you're inclined to talk about these things, come find us.